Welcome to the Like Iron Research Review, a subsection of the Like Iron podcast where we pick an academic article and discuss it. If you enjoy nerding out about strength, fitness, and performance, this is the podcast for you. Remember, research is ever-changing, and our views and opinions will change as well. None of the information in this show should be seen as medical advice, and you should always talk to your medical provider before starting a fitness regimen. Let's get into the cast, Like Iron.
Welcome to the Like Iron Research Review, a podcast where we pick a paper, talk about it, and talk about its applicability to practice. In this episode, also I'm Shannon.
I'm Wes.
Co-host Wes, he's right there. And today we're reading a paper and discussing it. It is entitled Training Volume, Not Frequency, Indicative of Maximal Strength and Adaptations to Resistance Training. The authors, there's a lot of them. We'll just, I don't know how to pronounce his name, but Ryan Colquhoun. I butchered that at all. Maybe I should just pick like a secondary author and say at all.
Say Bill Campbell, because Bill Campbell is a professor at USF.
Bill Campbell at all? No.
Yeah.
The primary author is the guy whose name I cannot pronounce, but his name's Ryan.
Yeah.
Good job. So in this study, they're looking at comparing high frequency training versus low frequency training, or not as frequent of training. Yeah. So I think we should start off with some definitions. So Wes, how do you define frequency, at least in this instance?
So frequency in general is, how many sessions do you get in per week in terms of strength training? And this can be, I would say, broken down into a few categories. So you can get like total training frequency. So it's like how many times are you actually training? And then you can get like body part or movement specific frequency. And so in this study, they were looking at basically the power lifts, so bench, squat, and deadlift. And so they had, the way they defined frequency here was the lower frequency group trained the bench, squat, and deadlift 3 times per week. I believe that the deadlift was only trained once per week in this one, though. And then in the higher frequency group, they did it 6 times per week. And I believe that the deadlift was only trained twice per week in that one. And so they're basically looking at the differences between 3 and 6, which, 3 is already a decent frequency and 6 is a very high frequency, I would say, of the main lifts. Mm-hmm. And you have anything you want to add to that definition before I move on?
No, and that's perfect. I think we should maybe hit on previous research briefly, which kind of,
yeah.
So basically, previous research has looked at very low frequency, like once per week, as opposed to twice or 3 times per week, and it's found that for hypertrophy and strength, there is a significant increase when we go to 3 times per week as opposed to 1, right?
Yeah.
And that's what volume equated. Is that correct?
Yeah. So far, I'd say that's pretty good overview. I'd say like so far, a lot of the research indicates like if you have a training frequency or per muscle group frequency of 2 to 3 times per week, you're probably in a good place.
Yeah.
And then like these huge bouts of training volume, usually underperform 2 to 3 times per week in most cases.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so this study is looking at a very high frequency, and volume is equated, so that means they're doing the same amount of sets and reps.
Yeah, and in this case too, they also had the same, I think it was average intensity. So intensity and volume were fairly similar between the lower frequency and the higher frequency group in this study.
Gotcha. Yeah, so intensity, volume are equalized, but they did say that, both programs used kind of an auto-regulatory approach. So they did a daily undulating periodization, which just means the sets and reps varied from day to day within a week. And then they did kind of an auto-regulatory progression. So I think on the last day of the week, there was like an AMRAP, so as many reps as possible, and that would adjust their load. So there was a slight difference between each subject in volume and intensity, but between groups they were equal.
Yep. And so Yeah, I think that's a good, just a little background of previous history and what they did. And so I think we can get into what they found.
Yeah.
So what they found in this study was it didn't really matter. At a certain point in time, we have that previous literature that suggests, two or three might be better than one, but in this study, 3 and 6 there's no difference. And so I think we can get into practical applications here. I think frequency is a good, vessel at which that you can, distribute your volume throughout the week. And so what I mean is this: if you can train 6 days a week, but you only have an hour, that might be a good, frequency at which you can distribute your volume. In a different case, maybe you only have 3 days where you can train per week. As long as you're getting your volume in those sessions, you're going to be fine. And so I think this comes down to the fact that, volume and average intensity are probably the things that we need to look at more so than frequency. And frequency is just a good practical means in which we can distribute volume throughout a week to meet the demands of our own lives.
And Wes, why is volume so important? Why are we looking at volume as a main variable?
Yeah. So we have a lot of previous literature that volume is linked to hypertrophy and strength. And so I would say like higher volumes. So in most cases, when you see volume in the literature, you see sets times reps. And you also see a term called volume load, which is sets times reps times weight. And then you also see like hard sets is another way people talk about volume. And it's like all these things, usually with higher volumes, you see, greater amounts of hypertrophy, and, with moderate to high volumes, greater amounts of strength, with the appropriate average intensity. So in a strength training study, that might be a slightly higher average intensity. And so basically, I think a conceptual way to think about volume is just like the amount of work you're putting in. How much are you putting in per session? You have any other definition you want to add?
No, I think that was perfect. It's just kind of, it seems to be based on previous literature, the main driver of hypertrophy and strength. So
Yeah.
uh,
Yeah.
yeah. So one thing they did mention is kind of the effect sizes. They were favoring the 6 times a week, but we can't really draw any conclusions from that. Is that right, Wes?
Yeah. So another stat that we see in exercise science a lot is something called an effect size. And in this case, they found what we typically call like a small to moderate effect. And so we were saying that, there might be some benefit to the, larger amount of frequency per week, but we really can't do anything with that just because it wasn't a really large effect. And so with that, you might be able to make, a weak argument to say that, more frequency can be useful, but at the same time, it's like you don't have a whole lot of evidence to support that claim.
Yeah. And it is important to know that this was a 6-week study with a pretty small group, so it gives us some good data to look at. But again, who knows what would have happened if we ran this in the long term? Maybe again, since as Wes said, it's just frequency is a vessel for volume. So spread it out over the long term. Since we know we need to increase volume over a very long term, it makes sense that a higher frequency eventually will probably be a good avenue for that.
Yeah, and
So,
I totally agree. I think with what you just said right there, frequency can be incredibly practical because frequency can also be a means in which you can increase volume. So we haven't really talked about that. We've talked about, volume equated, it doesn't really matter your frequency. However, if you're only training 3 days a week and over time you're increasing your volume, those sessions are going to become incrementally longer and longer and longer to the point where it's like you might be in the gym for 3 to 4 hours per session. And when you get to that point, for me at least, I find that hard to comply with. And then I start, kind of not liking going to the gym because I don't want to be there for that long. And so frequency can be useful because it's a means in which you can, allocate your volume throughout the week. And so if you're trying to increase your volume, or you've been training for a really long time and you train with higher volumes, and that's kind of what you need to progress, then having a higher frequency can be useful because then you can distribute that throughout, sessions. And now your session's only an hour and a half, 2 hours compared to like 3 to 4 hours per session. So I think there's a big practical aspect of frequency in terms of programming.
yeah, and anecdotally, when I try to shove a bunch of volume into one or into 2 or sometimes even 3 days. It's just like when you're in there for a long time and it crushes you too. So it can have, if you're doing a very high volume in one day, it can have downstream effects on the rest of the week. One thing important to notice, as we always mention in kind of like every single podcast, is when you're training somebody or you're training yourself, it's important to look at the individual response, as this research just looks at averages and means and kind of measures of centrality. So there's always going to be individual responses. So some people might handle frequency a little bit better. Some people might respond to higher frequency or lower frequency. Even if you just look at this study itself and say the 6 times per week, some people gained like 25% increases in strength. One person lost strength. And in the 3 times per week, some people gained 25%. Some people only gain like 3%. So it's hard to always take this as black or white.
Yeah, absolutely. I think you hit on something, really key there. In research, especially in the exercise science research, we deal with means. So you're dealing with, how does the mean, respond to this? And you get some sort of deviation away from that mean. So you get people who don't respond very well and people who respond really well. You guys can go back and listen to our podcast on non-responders about this topic. But like Shannon said, again, it comes back to monitoring the individual. The research is a fantastic place to start. Like if you can set someone up with 2 to 3 times per week frequency with the amount of, volume recommended, which is usually about 10 sets per exercise per week, I think that's a good starting place. And then monitor from there. You can increase or decrease based on those recommendations and then see and track progress throughout that, client's career.
Yeah. And don't just change something for the sake of changing something. Do it for a specific reason to drive progress.
Yeah.
Or for enjoyment of training even too. But you should have a reason.
Yeah, absolutely.
All right. I think that wraps up this discussion on this paper. Is a pretty brief paper and pretty straight to the point. Do you have anything else to add to it?
No, I think that we covered it fairly well.
Yeah. So higher frequency, like really high frequency, definitely seems to have diminishing returns, but it can be an avenue to increase training volume. So this has been an episode of the Like Iron Research Review. See ya.
See ya.
Thanks for listening to this Like Iron production. You can find us on Instagram at ShannonDubs, at like.iron_west, and at like.iron.strong_Jackson. As always, we love to hear from our audience, so if you have a question or want to chat, drop a line in the comments or hit us up on social media. If you like what you hear, let it be known. Like and review or tell your friends. And as always, stay strong like iron.